There's a prayer of St. Francis that I say often, but especially I fall back on it when I can't figure out the ways of God. For instance, why did God make a world in which Bosnia and Rwanda can take place? So the omnipotent, most holy, most high, and supreme God, all good, supreme good, total good, you who alone are good. We give you all praise, all glory, all thanks, all honor and blessing, and every good forever. Amen. You should probably know the saying, repetitio est mater studiorum. Repetition is the mother of learning. When it comes to trying to give 9 talks on poverty, and out of Matthew, it will require at times some repetition. And so Father Natalini sends us back to a text we have already taken, Matthew 10, 5 to 10. Then he summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to drive them out and to cure every disease and every illness. The names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, and called Peter, and his brother Andrew, and so on down the line of the 12 apostles. Jesus sent out these 12 after instructing them thus: do not go into pagan territory or enter a Samaritan town. Go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, make this proclamation: the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, drive out demons. Without cost you have received, without cost you are to give. Do not take gold or silver or copper for your belts, no sack for the journey, or second tunic, or sandals, or walking stick. The laborer deserves his keep. That is your charter. You are missionaries sent out like the apostles. And your focus is the kingdom. And your roots are in St. Francis, who was moved by this passage, as we heard before, to exclaim, this is what I have been looking for. This is what I want with all my heart. But you are not called to follow that literally. You are called to the spirit underlying it. And that is a lifestyle of freedom from egotistical and worldly interest, a lifestyle of detachment from possessions and power. Your call is to be at the disposition of Christ, your King, for the service of your sisters and brothers. There's a book on the spirituality of St. Bonaventure, and there's a hymn one of our friars wrote called Nothing for Your Journey. The message of the gospel is travel light. And you will better be prepared to be the light and the leaven in your world. Now, a question I ran into many years ago when I started serving you missionaries is, what does traveling light mean for you? Does it mean the same thing as for me in the first order? It wasn't until I read your rule and constitutions, and especially what Father Gemelli had to say, that I picked up the differences. And then I wasn't trying to make the missionaries live poverty the way I was living poverty. Though, as you'll see, oftentimes there's not that much difference. So you own your own property and possessions. In the novitiate, we were taught to put on anything that was there that we had brought with us for the use of Frater Jeffrey. So it's not mine, just for my use. So we don't own anything personally, and the province and the order doesn't own anything. The Pope, according to the law, owns everything that the Franciscans have. And 999 times out of 1,000, that doesn't mean much. We operate as if we own things. So we have the same challenge as you. What does it mean to say nothing for your journey? How am I going to live the first beatitude? Blessed are you poor. Exegetes say that that was the original saying of Jesus. Blessed are you poor. And that Matthew later on, when he was talking to a congregation that was not physically poor, materially poor, said, blessed are the poor in spirit. But how am I going to be poor in spirit? While I have the things for my personal living and for my ministry. How are you called to be poor in spirit? But you, as the rule says, exercise legal ownership of your property and the use of goods acquired by inheritance, gifts, or other lawful means. So your rule responds to that. Conformable to your vow in poverty, you are to consider yourself the steward or the administrator of your goods. So you own them, but act as if you did not own them. You're just the steward, answerable to God for what you have. And the Constitution consider, and you are to avoid carefully the temptation to possess things and accumulate goods. But you need to possess these things, so what is the temptation to be avoided that they're talking about? Well, as I said, Gemelli helped me to find the answer to that. He says, a Christian can possess the goods of this world without being possessed by them. Otherwise, she becomes their slave. Possess what you own, but don't be possessed by what you own. Don't be overly anxious about them. Don't spend inordinate time worrying over them. And as you get older, don't get overly anxious about how am I going to make it until I die. Put your trust in God. It continues, there are various degrees of poverty. St. Francis took Jesus literally and sold all he had and he followed Jesus. He didn't want to own anything. Once he heard a brother say, that is Francis's hut. And immediately Francis moved out of it into another hut. One time, this is a little insight into Francis, he liked to whittle. And so one time he made a nice bowl. And then while he was praying, he was thinking, gee, it's a beautiful bowl that I made. So after prayer, he threw it in the fire because it was interfering with his prayer. So he was trying to be detached from everything, but that's not. That total poverty is not what you are called to. He says you aren't called to that degree of poverty. So I suppose some of you individually might be called to that, but it'd be a special grace, a special calling. But your constitutions and the rule don't call you to that. So among the degrees of poverty, Gemelli says, you have chosen a lesser one. Not because of lack of generosity, but because you must not be a religious living in a monastery. You have to live in the world. And so you live in your own home, in your own surroundings, and he says in such a manner that no one knows the secret of your bond with God. And then he gets a little more concrete. To observe the spirit of poverty, you are called, first of all, to avoid the superfluous of expenses. Secondly, you are to endeavor to be frugal in personal expenses and generous with your neighbor. Thirdly, draw up a will justly and charitably, remembering the works of the church. So those are three things he says for your poverty. So what is superfluous? Well, he says, especially that which smacks of luxury. In this day and age, what is luxury? Uh, I'm not a good judge of that. I grew up during the Depression and then went into the Franciscans where poverty was drummed into us. And so I find it hard to spend money on anything. So maybe in our discussion afterwards you can talk about it. What came to my mind was that kind of the in thing right now in our society is about 3 or 4 gold chains around your neck and 5 or 6 rings on your fingers. To me, that sounds like luxury, but maybe you'll give me a reality check later. The missionary, I would think, would aim at the simple and the becoming. One of our secular Franciscans, who's a lady in her 80s now, always is so nicely dressed. And everything that she wears, she got at a thrift shop or some friend gave it to her. It's all secondhand. The opposite of that is a relative of mine who wouldn't think of buying anything except at Nordstrom's. My nephew says he's got part ownership in Nordstrom's. That's the opposite extreme. But this is what you are weighing for yourself when you say you're trying to live your life of poverty. Another problem, I think, is that of kitchen paraphernalia. Every Christmas, a new gadget comes out. Everybody's got to buy. And you may be able to resist the temptation, but Aunt Becky wonders, what do I get my dear unmarried niece? And so she buys you the latest gadget. And then you got that problem. Will it even be hurt if you contributed to the parish bazaar? Recently, my sister bought me an ice chest, to take on a picnic. And it was thoughtful of her, very loving of her. And I'm saying, should I give that to the parish bazaar? I haven't used it yet. I don't know if I'm going to use it. So anyway, these are kinds of things that we wrestle with in trying to live our poverty. Poverty isn't easy, but according to Gemelli, it isn't supposed to be. He says another aspect of poverty which gives it the character of virtue is that it always carries a hardship, a privation, a sacrifice. This is why your life, if it is poor, is meritorious. A poverty which does not involve hardships, sacrifices, or privations is not poverty. So if you were thinking up to this time, gee, our poverty isn't so bad, it's not as bad as Francis and so on. Gemelli brings you down to earth. A poverty which does not involve hardships, sacrifices, or privations is not poverty. I'm out there and sit in a chair and think about it. Many of you, I gather, drawing up a budget and keeping monthly accounts and submitting the budget for review is one of the main hardships of your poverty. I can resonate with that because I have my own bank account, and in recent years I have to make up an annual budget. Quarterly I have to send in a report. Annually I have to send in a report to the Finance Committee. And it gets harder as I get more forgetful. So that's one of the hardships of poverty. So is poverty just a penance? One of the things about which we say, suffer it, it's good for you. And that's not what poverty is meant to be. You're bond of poverty with the Lord. For us Franciscans, it's something deeper and something personal. And again, this is repetition, but Francis and Clare chose poverty because Jesus and Mary were poor. And so living, the gospel is living as Jesus lived. And the thing was, they figured Jesus could have been born of a king. He could have been born of a rich person. He could have been born of a high priest's house. But he was born in Nazareth of poor people. What is God saying to us? That's the thinking of Francis and Clare. And so our life of poverty is to try to live what God had in mind when he chose to have his son born of Mary in Nazareth. It is indicated in his preaching why he modeled such a life. As he says, it's more difficult for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter heaven. Now, whether that's just a saying, or whether, as some exegetes say, in Jerusalem there was a gate that was very narrow and very low, and that was called Camel Gate. The eye of the needle, it was called the eye of the needle. Whether either one, we get the message. It's darn hard for rich people to get into heaven. Recently, the lottery got up to $54 million in California. And I asked the secular Franciscans, and in my homilies I asked the people, what are you buying lottery tickets for? Do you want to be rich? After what Jesus said? So, what is it about riches? They absorb us from what is more important. They distract us. Riches lead to unconcern for those who don't have riches. And it leads to a sense of independence. Boy, I'm doing fine. I don't need God. Whereas poor people, and I don't want to romanticize the poor, but this is what is generally, I think, can be said. They tend to be more open, more ready for the gospel, more willing to acknowledge they need God. So Jesus went especially where his message would be heard. And he picked up a reputation. He likes to be with sinners and with the poor. Those are the ones we're going to listen to. So poverty is the right seedbed for what Jesus wants to teach us. The Constitutions express this. The missionaries, following the example of Francis, bind themselves to live in conformity with Christ, who was poor. They value created goods as the Father's gift to us humans, and they pledge themselves to use them with detachment and freedom of heart. In this way, created goods become steps which lead the missionaries to God, the supreme good. There was a Catholic magazine in the 40s and 50s called Integrity. Anybody remember that? Well, one month the drawing was of Francis walking through what used to be called a haberdashery, a men's clothing store. And there's Francis going through this store, his arms in his sleeves, walking by all these wallets and cufflinks and shirts and ties and suits. And there's the most beautiful smile on his face, a smile of detachment. It frees the heart. That is what Jesus wants of us and why he calls us to poverty. And Gemelli says, be poor in order to imitate Christ. Poor in order to be rich in joy. Poor in spirit to be rich in holiness. Poor in spirit to be humble. Lord, teach us what you want us to aim at when you say, take nothing for your journey. Help us to treasure the freedom that comes from detachment from possessions. Help us to be frugal with ourselves and generous with others in need. Amen. This prayer is from the reflection of Francis on the Our Father. Lord, that we may love you with our whole heart by always thinking of you, with our whole soul by always desiring you, with our whole mind by directing all our intentions to you, and by seeking your glory in everything, and with our whole strength by spending all our energies and affections of soul and body in the service of your love and of nothing else. And may we love our neighbors as ourselves by drawing them all with our full strength to your love, by rejoicing in the good fortunes of others as well as our own, and by sympathizing with the misfortunes of others, by giving offense to no one. So as you know, you are kingdom people. You're living in the kingdom. Jesus said the kingdom is among you. But also you are missionaries of the kingship of Christ. And so you are kingdom workers. As I have been saying, the kingdom is already, and yet it is not yet. It's not yet what it could be, what God wants it to be. So your mission, my mission, is to help the kingdom become where we are. This is your identity, or as Gemelli liked to say, this is your physiognomy. So our reflection this afternoon is on the kingdom parables in Matthew 13. And the first is the parable of the sower. On that day Jesus went out of the house and sat down by the sea. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat down, and whole crowds stood along the shore. And he spoke to them at length in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky ground, where it had little soil. It sprang up at once, but the soil was not deep. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and it withered for lack of roots. Some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it. But some seed fell on rich soil, and produced fruit 100 or 60 or 30-fold. Whoever has ears ought to hear. So we are the soil. Jesus sows his word, his wisdom in us. And not everybody is ready for this seed. And so not much wheat is produced. But the point of the parable is that for those who are ready, they will produce an abundant harvest. And that is why Jesus has come, to call people to prepare the earth and receive his word, so that it can grow and mature in them. And as kingdom people, that's the first part of your mission, the growth and the maturing of the kingdom in your hearts. We want to perfect your instrument so that your king can play his melody on you. You want to put on his priorities, his attitudes, his values, his judgments. That's what Paul means when he said, put on the mind of Christ. Then people who encounter you encounter Christ. Putting on the mind of Christ is a lifelong process, but it has its own rewards. The more we are what we ought to be, the more peaceful and joyful we are. And then there's the parable of the mustard seed. He proposed another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a person took and sowed in a field. It is the smallest of the seeds, yet when full grown it is the largest of plants. It becomes a large bush, and the birds of the sky come and dwell in its branches. So in this parable we discover that the kingdom is not just in the hearts of each of us, it is in the church. Jesus wants his kingdom to be visible, and he wants it to have some stability. So as I said in the homily at the, this was at the homily at the beginning of the assembly. Some of you have not heard this. God gives us people who are charismatic. They live the charism, it attracts people, and then the followers institutionalize it, give it structure so that it can continue. And this is what happened. The church was developed by the apostles, given structure and so on. And in the study of institutions, this goes on and thrives, but then it can wither. And that is that the structures and the practices and the attitudes can begin to choke the charism. And then there is need for renewal. And that's what the Second Vatican Council was seeking to do. The fathers of the council knew that they were not saying the last word, because they said the church must constantly be renewing itself. And the same is true of my order, and the same is true of your institute. We've been through all kinds of renewals. You are young, and so you're just getting into periods that I call for renewal. So this is the mustard tree that God has planted there. And we are blessed to be part of that mustard tree. The second part of our mission is to help the church to become the full-blown, healthy church that it is meant to be. And we can do that by taking an active part in the ministries and the work of the church. And by being adult, participative members of the church. Remember, long ago we had a meeting of the secular Franciscans, and one of the speakers there said, the lay people need to educate the bishops. That's part of their mission. And and I think that is true, and that we need to speak up and to help the church to become what the church ought to be. At the same time, we need to listen to the bishops. And you are blessed if you are in a diocese where there is this interchange going on. And so we're in a much more healthy position in the church at the present time in many places. But the church is evolving, and it needs to be renewed, and so lay people have a part in doing that. At the same time, of course, I want to remind you of what Pope John Paul II said, and in the apostolic letter to the laity, right in the beginning, he kind of knocked me off my chair when I saw it. He says, there's something a temptation that you lay people have to watch out for. And that is that you do not get involved only in church work. He said, you are lay people. And your place is also in the world. And so he says that you should be involved in the professions, the media, the arts, and in politics. So you bring the charism of Jesus there as a yeast. And so your work is for the kingdom is in the church, and your work for the kingdom is outside in the lay world. So, and this kingdom is that Wherever human affairs take place according to the vision of Jesus, there is the kingdom. Wherever the things are going on that are contrary to the vision of Jesus, there's the lack of the kingdom. So you want to help to bring the kingdom to your world. And at times, this is helping to build up the church. There was a man who was a seeker, and he had no religion. So he started going to the various churches and denominations and so on. And he landed up as a Catholic. And the reason he said that he landed up as a Catholic was because he saw so many Catholics trying to make a difference in the world. That's evangelization. You're going out doing what you ought to do, and you're attracting people. So the mustard seed exists for the followers of Jesus, and it is open then to all that can be attracted by the followers of Jesus to join up on the tree. And then there is the parable of the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure buried in a field, which a person finds and hides again, and out of joy goes and sells all he has and buys that field. And again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking for fine pearls. When he finds a pearl of great price, he goes and sells all he has and buys it. So I think we've all experienced Jesus and his way as our great treasure. Those of us who are born Catholics perhaps have drifted at times into kind of taking it for granted. And it helps at times then to run into a new convert who is exulting over having found the pearl. And then all of a sudden you realize, gee, we have the pearl too. So we want to rejoice. We want to thank God that we have found the pearl. And one of the things that can bring it home to us too is to look around you and see people who are drifting. They have this question, what's the meaning of life? Where am I going? What's it all about? Then we can really appreciate the treasures that we've been gifted with. But the parable indicates there is a sacrifice called for on our part. So he went and sold all he had to buy the field, or to buy the pearl. So I already spoke to you about how living poorly and simply enables us to more fully live the Christ life. But we can have more than money and possessions in our purse. So I return to a theme that we've had before. The gospel speaks of the need to die to self in order to live the Christ life fully. And so we, as I've said before, we are made in the image and likeness of God. And we are capable of doing what I have, like Jesus said, doing what I have done and more. So that's the inner me and the inner potential that I have. And we don't want that self to die. We want that self to grow. And the fact it's immortal. It never will die. So what we want to get out of our purse then is our false self. And as we said, these are the attitudes, judgments, values, habits that are opposed to what Jesus stands for. And again, speaking of my own experience, my type tends to be judgmental. Perfectionist, but especially that other people be perfect. And so that's something, I'm trying to work at to get out of my purse. And some of us may carry prejudices that we picked up along the way. maybe prejudice against people of other religions. I remember when I was young, my mother remarking, "Why is that white girl going around with that dark fellow?" And in our day, there were no Negroes in our neighborhood. This fellow was Portuguese. And the ironic thing is that my mother was raised mostly by her grandmother. And when my great-grandmother wanted to be mean to my mother, she would call her Blackie, because she had black hair and olive skin. And yet my mother picked up from her this prejudice against people with dark skin. And I'm happy to say that she evolved out of it. Later on, she didn't make remarks like that. But we can, these are things that we can pick up, and they work against the kingdom. People see us as prejudiced, and what do I want to do with Catholics? They're prejudiced. So, and then as I say, we have to watch out for denial. I'm not prejudiced, but it's true. All Irish are drunks. All blacks don't take care of their property, and all women are poor drivers. When I taught logic, these were the hasty generalizations I used as examples. But they're prejudices, huh? And but that's always the introduction. I'm not prejudiced, but. And so we want to get those things out of our purse. Again, sharing my own experience, as I was saying, I'm in my 70s. Lord, can I rest? And so he showed me something else recently. And that is that I have strong opinions, and I want everybody to know it. So I'm a letter writer to politicians, and now I got to stop and say, am I really trying to do some good, or am I just wanting them to know my opinion? So that's something I'm reflecting on and working on. You can't stop. You got to keep working. So we want to be humble as Jesus was humble. So we need to get out of any pride in our purse. So I keep using the figure of the purse just to recall that emptying ourselves of these faults is a form of poverty of spirit. As we work on these things, we're doing interior kingdom. We're trying to make our hearts like the heart of our King. So these are things we want to spend in order to buy or pay for the pearl that the Lord has given us. The last parable of the kingdom is the parable of the weeds among the wheat. He proposed another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven may be likened to a man who sowed good seed in the field. While everyone was asleep, his enemy came and sowed weeds all through the wheat, and then went off. When the crop grew and bore fruit, the weeds appeared as well. The slaves of the householder came to him and said, "Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where have the weeds come from?" He answered, "That enemy has done this." The slave said to him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" He replied, "No, if you pull up the weeds, you might uproot the wheat along with them. Let them grow together until the harvest. Then at the harvest time I will say to the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles and burn them, but gather the wheat into your barn." Even in Jesus' day, there were weeds among the wheat. Judas is the main example. But for a long time, I used to think about the early church in terms of that ideal community on the Acts of the Apostles. Everybody sold what they had, and they had everything in common, and they shared with each other and all of that. But if you read more carefully the scriptures, there were those who were Christians in name only in those days, but more so, there were those who were called Judaizing Christians. And those were the Jewish converts who maintained that non-Jewish Christians needed to be circumcised, they need to keep all the customs of the Pharisees, and they needed to go to the synagogue on Saturday. And even after the Council of Jerusalem, which said they didn't need to do all these things, these people insisted. If you are a Christian, you've got to do all of these things. So the reality is that there are some bad weeds among the good in the field of the church. So Jesus is preparing us in this parable for that reality. And it's been true all down through the history of the church. There's evil as well as good in people and institutions. But the thing that comes through in this parable is God respects people, and God is patient with people, and God holds out hope for conversion. So Jesus is giving us a lead in how we should look upon those in the church who appear to us to be sinners. For instance, to be holding unorthodox views or practices. We know there are those who say, that is not what the Pope teaches. If you don't believe it, get out of the church. Is that what Jesus would say? Jesus, we see, as we look at his example, he welcomed sinners. At times he sought them out. He had the reputation of liking to be among sinners. So he was seeking, the Good Shepherd, seeking after the conversion of people. He said to the woman accused of adultery, I don't condemn you. Go, but don't commit that sin again. So we can ask, how would Jesus look on someone who has had an abortion? How would he look on gays who are having active sex? I was reflecting on this recently when hearing about Christians who are proposing discriminatory laws against homosexuals. Jesus was gentle with sinners, with one exception. The only time you see Jesus talking harshly to sinners was against the self-righteous Pharisees. And the self-righteous Pharisees had contempt for sinners. We are the holy ones, and those are the sinners. And righteousness is something we don't want to find in our purse. It's not of Jesus Christ. We can judge that certain actions are sinful. But Jesus calls us to love the sinner, be patient, work for the conversion of the sinners. There are always in the church, there are the problems. And there always have been, and in past times much worse, people in the church, leaders in the church, who were leading sinful lives, luxurious lives, and stealing from the church. There have been this all through history. Things aren't as bad today as some of the history that you read. And what we want to hang on to is the inner core. And that is, the church is Jesus and his members. And the gates of hell will never prevail against them. Up on the surface, there are these people that are not what they ought to be. people that are not Orthodox, people who are using their authority in a wrong way. But these are all surface things. The reality is Jesus and his members, this church that is eternal, that is what we want to remember and to help to grow. So, in my and Testament. Let them always love one another. Let them always love and be faithful to our Holy Lady Poverty. And let them always be faithful and subject to the prelates and all clerics of the Holy Mother Church. So the parables of the kingdom help us to understand how to do this. And Clare, in her letter to Agnes of Prague, says, "Contempt of the world has pleased you more than its honors, poverty more than earthly riches, and you have sought to store up greater treasures in heaven rather than on earth, where rust does not consume, nor moth destroy, nor thieves break in and steal. Your reward then is a very great in heaven. And you have truly merited to be called a sister, a spouse, and mother of the Son, of the Father, and of the Most High, and of the glorious Virgin." And that's the reward for kingdom workers. Lord, thank you for calling us into your kingdom and making us your kingdom workers. Help us to work in harmony with you, so that your plan for us human beings may be accomplished. Amen. if any of those who were up half the night last night fall asleep, just leave them alone. There's nothing deathless here that they have to hear. We've already said the prayer of Francis. This is the feast of Blessed Juniper Serra, so I thought I would say just a bit about him. He's called the Apostle of California. He was grew up in Mallorca, an island off of Spain, became a Franciscan, taught philosophy and theology. So he's a middle-aged man before he was able to give in to the call to go to the missions in Mexico. And there he gave home missions. He went around to parishes giving missions. And then he was made pastor of a parish among the Indians. But deep in his heart, he wanted to preach to those who had never heard of Jesus before. So he finally got his chance when he was sent off to Lower California to take over the Jesuit missions when the Jesuits were suppressed. And then his chance came when he accompanied the soldiers and the settlers sent to California to keep the Russians from taking over. So it's always something political, isn't there? So he established 9 of the 21 missions before he died. We're going to be talking about crosses today, and Juniper Serra had 2. When he landed in Mexico, some bug bit him, and that never healed. It just kept coming back. And so all during his lifetime, he had to deal with that. In fact, on the way to California at one time, it was so bad that the head of the expedition was saying, "I don't think you can go on." And Juniper Serra was a stubborn man. He went on. The second cross that he had to bear was with stubborn governors and with stubborn viceroys, who made him fight for everything that he wanted for the Indians. As I said, he was a stubborn man, and so the history of the governor and of Serra was really an interesting story to read. But anyway, that is Juniper Serra, whom we are celebrating today. You're thinking about, gee, we would like to have Carmina Borelli beatified. It took a couple of 100 years to get a miracle for Serra, so we hope it doesn't take that long for Carmina. Our reflection today is on Matthew 16:24 to 27. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What profit would there be for one to gain the whole world and forfeit his life? Or what can one give in exchange for his life? For the Son of Man will come with his angels in his Father's glory, and then he will repay everyone according to his and her conduct." So we have talked today about discipleship and suffering. As Bonhoeffer wrote, there is a cost to discipleship. Christian living is not free grace, and is not no sweat accompanying of Jesus. He suffered, he was rejected, he died among criminals, and so if we set our steps in those of Jesus, at times we will be rejected, opposed, scorned, we will suffer. Even in our ordinary living, we encounter crosses. So taking up our cross daily is part of the discipleship we're called to. So first of all, what Jesus is primarily speaking about is the suffering we possibly will encounter in professing our faith. There was a time in our history, you probably know, when the same animosity being heaped on immigrants today was addressed to the Irish, to the Germans, to the Italians, to Catholics in general. Convents in Philadelphia were burnt. We Catholics don't face that today. The Southern Baptists used to accuse us of having cloven hoofs and sacrificing babies in our liturgies. Things are quieter now. But occasionally you run up against someone who resists you or distrusts you because you are a Catholic. Perhaps more likely is the opposition you experience if you take up at work something that is unjust and object to it, and then you begin to suffer. And especially if you are a whistleblower. And even in friendlier circles these days, you know, you're in a conversation, maybe with family, with friends, and you oppose abortion. And down comes the load on you. As the saying goes, there are hot buttons issues that trigger attacks. And so some of these things you probably all have experienced. We are blessed that we have the courage of our convictions anyway, and speak up and propose the gospel view of the situation. As I said, the secular Franciscans have the expression in their rule, going from gospel to life and life to gospel. We want to do that with our own lives, but we want to do that in addressing the situations around us. But as I say, your contribution may not always be appreciated. And we may have to suffer as Christ did. Secondly, taking up our daily cross involves a regimen of self-discipline that we voluntarily undertake. And I spoke earlier of how, you know, when we were in religion at 5 to 12, we went in and had our particular examen. And the idea was to surface what am I doing wrong, and how can I get to stop it. And then each day you checked out how you were doing. And that is a daily cross. And especially because of the experience, you probably have had it too. If you're trying to overcome something, it's like climbing a mountain of shale. You know, you put your foot in and it slips down. You put your foot in and it slips down. And so, you come back 2 months later and say, Lord, I don't see any progress. But my experience is that, you know, some months later, all of a sudden you say, hey, I'm higher up this mountain than I thought I was. And that feels good. And just about that time, the Lord shows you another thing. And so, start up that shale mountain again. That is a daily cross, just the effort to overcome pride or whatever it is. Now, after I became a priest, I went back into the seminary and spent 30 years there in the seminary teaching. And I taught that approach to the spiritual life, divide and conquer. And much later, after I was not involved in doing this teaching seminarians, I came across a proposal that, hey, there's a better way of going about it. And that's a more positive approach of developing a positive attitude. For instance, I want to live in harmony with Jesus, and I want to do what Jesus would do, and I want to avoid what Jesus would not do. Or I want to do the will of God in all things. I want to make my life a return of love to Jesus. And so the suggestion there is that, first of all, you're not just concentrating on this one thing and maybe neglecting other things, but also that it's more positive, not just what's wrong with me. And I believe that is the better approach, but it still calls for attention and working at it. So whatever approach we use, we do need to keep going through conversion, as I've said. We need to keep dying to the false self we've taken on. And that's the daily cross we want to carry for Christ. St. Francis, in his 10th admonition, says, many people, when they sin or receive an injury, often blame the enemy or some neighbor. But this is not right. For each one has the real enemy in his own power. That is, the body through which he sins. Therefore, blessed is that servant who, having such an enemy in his power, will always hold him captive and wisely guard himself against him. Because as long as he does this, no other enemy, seen or unseen, will be able to harm him. Now, first of all, you have in Francis some of the medieval idea of body and soul. And secondly, that the body is the origin of all temptation. What is it? Where does my pride come from? Where does my judgmentalism come from? It's not coming out of the body. So, what Francis has to say is true if we say not the body, but the self. I am in possession of that. I can do something about it. And so I want them to do something about that. And that's that conversion that we go through. And one measure of conversion of the self is to take on voluntary penances. This has been in the tradition of all religions, and especially fasting. But other means, sometimes we call them penances, but spending a half hour of prayer, that's a very positive and good thing, but it's a discipline. And seeing that I do it every day is a discipline. And call it a penance, call it discipline, it's a good thing. But that is a way in which to get the self under control. Now, speaking about penances, Gemelli has an interesting passage. He says, because I have explicitly forbidden corporal punishments to the missionaries, flagellations, night vigils, extraordinary diets, and hair shirts. Aren't you glad you don't have to do those things? You don't have to do those things. But, he says, some have drawn the erroneous conclusion that missionaries are not to live a life of penitence. I guess it means they're a life of penances. He says, the passion, cross, and death of Christ teach us that we cannot imitate him if we do not follow the same path, if we do not put our cross on our shoulders. So Lent is not the only time then for self-discipline. We need it all year long. But what you need is not what I need. What I need this year is not what I needed last year. And so we need to keep asking ourselves. And I hope you have broken out of this idea, that, well, Lent is here, I'll give up candy, and I won't go to movies. And that's, a little bit of help. But what we really want to do is get down to root things and find the discipline that's going to get at the root of things. So, now, you are fortunate, I am fortunate, we both have a rule and constitution. And living according to that is a discipline. And that's primary. Now, when I was a young religious again, there was this old saying, live the rule and you'll become a saint. and I discovered that it wasn't true. In order to live the rule, you got to develop the discipline in yourself in order to do the things in there that you don't want to do. So that's where the self-discipline comes in. Something extra is needed besides your rule and your constitutions. Something that develops in you the will and the motivation to do those things. And that's what we're talking about. Another part of our daily cross is the physical sufferings that come into our lives. And some of these are temporary, and some are chronic. Those of you who have, chronic diseases know what I'm talking about. They tell me, you got cancer, and one of these days you're going to feel it. Your attention is on your body all the time. Is that cancer? And so one of the things that the discipline that I need right now is get out of yourself. Don't be always looking in on yourself and thinking about, is that my cancer? Is that what I'm going to have to bear? And so on. But anyway, I've had all kinds of aches and pains I never paid any attention before because of that. So anyway, each suffering that comes into us is an opportunity to suffer with Christ. And what I try to do myself, and I recommend to people who have these sufferings coming in, is the approach of St. Paul. I fill up in my body the sufferings of the Lord Jesus Christ for the sake of the church. And I like to add in for the sake of the world. So if there's any suffering, whether it's spiritual, frustration, anything like that, united with the sufferings of Christ for the church and for the world. And I think your experience is the same as mine. If I sink into self-pity, why me, why this, the cross just gets heavier. And but when I turn it into a prayer with St. Paul, the cross gets lighter. Now, our cross at times can be more spiritual and physical. Worry over your financial future. Alienation from some member of the family. Or someone at work who dislikes you and harasses you. Spiritual or physical. It's a cross. And the way to carry it is the same. What we aim at is to reach that stage St. Paul reached. I rejoice to suffer for the sake of Christ. We know the conclusion of Francis's tale of perfect joy. That's the story, where he's knocking on the door and the brother is telling you a bunch of imposters get lost, and he slams the door and they're out there in the water and the mud. And finally his companion gets the answers that what is perfect joy? And Francis says, it's the overcoming of yourself. And here we talk about the joys that come from carrying our cross. So the first fruit of it is that we are in conformity with Christ. Christ suffered, we suffer, we're suffering with him. It's a love response. And recall the two prayers of St. Francis. Lord, that I might feel in my heart some of the love that moved you to suffer so much for me. And then, if you have the courage, Lord, that I might feel in my body some of the pain that you suffered for love of me. So if we make this approach to our self-discipline and to our suffering, carrying our cross, then a work of love, then I think that we will carry it out well. Our sister Claire told Agnes of God, if you suffer with him, you shall reign with him. If you weep with him, you shall rejoice with him. If you die with him on the cross of tribulation, you shall possess heavenly mansions in the splendor of the saints, and in the book of life your name shall be called glorious among all people. Because of this you shall share always and forever the glory of the kingdom of heaven in place of earthly and passing things, and everlasting treasures instead of those that perish, and you shall live forever. So the cost of discipleship may be great, but the reward is greater. Jesus, you willingly bore your sufferings for love of me. I will willingly suffer for love of you. Support me with your grace and presence, and lead me into conformity with you. Amen.